In 1954, a man walked into a naval scrapyard and pointed at a rusting warship. It had spent World War II escorting convoys through submarine-infested waters. Every rivet reeked of gunpowder and salt. He paid $4,000 for it. 4 years later, Winston Churchill was sipping whiskey in its library. Maria Callas was singing in its dining room. Marilyn Monroe was leaning on its railings, watching the sun melt into the Aegean. The man who bought that wreck turned it into the most famous yacht on Earth. He named it after his daughter. His name was Aristotle Onassis. He was a refugee who arrived in Argentina with $60 sewn into his trousers. By the time he died, he controlled more oil transport than most nations. He owned an island. He married America's most famous widow. He broke the rules of global commerce and rewrote them in his own hand. But here is the part they put in smaller type. His son died at 24. His daughter died at 37. His fortune, once valued in the billions, passed to a 3-year-old girl who would one day sell his paradise island to a stranger. This is not just a story about money. It is a story about what happens when a man builds an empire to escape his past, and that empire swallows his future. Part 1. Ashes. Smyrna, in the early 1900s, was a city that smelled of tobacco and salt water. Sitting on the western coast of what is now Turkey, it was one of the great trading ports of the Mediterranean, a place where East met West, in a swirl of languages, religions, and ambitions. Greek merchants, Armenian traders, Turkish officials, Levantine bankers, European diplomats, they all crowded its avenues and coffee houses, cutting deals over thick coffee in the haze of cigarette smoke. Commerce was the city's religion, and tobacco was its sacrament. Aristotle Socrates Onassis was born there on January 20th, 1906, in the twilight years of the Ottoman Empire. His father, Socrates, was a prosperous tobacco merchant who ran a network of warehouses and a small fleet of boats, exporting his product to France and England. His mother, Penelope Doleglu, came from money of her own. There was a sister, Artemis. By any measure, this was a privileged childhood, the kind that produces lawyers, diplomats, or gentlemen traders who inherit the family firm and pass it quietly to their sons. The young Aristotle grew up watching the rhythms of money firsthand, ships arriving in the harbor, deals struck on the waterfront, fortunes rising and falling with each cargo. But Smyrna sat on a fault line, not only geological, but political. The city was balanced uneasily between empires, and the ground was about to open. In September 1922, after Greece lost its war against Turkey, the Turkish army retook Smyrna. What followed was one of the worst episodes of ethnic violence in the 20th century. On September 13th, a fire, still considered one of the most brutal acts of ethnic cleansing of its era, consumed the Greek and Armenian quarters. Homes were looted. Civilians were massacred in the streets. Over 100,000 people were killed or disappeared. Hundreds of thousands more became refugees overnight. The Onassis family lost everything: property, ships, warehouses, savings, reputation, all of it gone in a matter of days. They escaped with their lives and nothing else. Aristotle was 16 years old. One day, he sat at a family table with silverware and servants. The next, he was a displaced teenager carrying his belongings in a bundle, standing in a line with thousands of other refugees. That kind of rupture leaves a scar that never fully heals. But it also lights a fire that never fully goes out. Years later, he would say, "When we lost everything in Smyrna, I decided that I would never allow fate to rob me again." It was the kind of promise a boy makes to himself in the dark. And it was the kind of promise that would shape and eventually distort everything he built. In 1923, while his parents settled in Greece and tried to piece together the remnants of their old life, Aristotle chose a different path. He took roughly $60 sewn into the lining of his trousers for safety and boarded a ship bound for South America. He carried a Nansen passport, a document issued by the League of Nations for people who belonged to no country. He had no flag, no legal protection, no safety net. He was 17 years old, heading to the other side of the world. Buenos Aires, in the 1920s, was a city that announced itself through smell before anything else. Roasting beef from the parillas on every corner, diesel from the port machinery, the damp sweetness of the Rio de la Plata drifting through the grid of wide, European-style boulevards. Argentina was rich from beef and grain, its economy humming with the kind of confidence that invites the world's hungry to try their luck. The cafes along Avenida de Mayo were filled with Italians, Spaniards, Germans, Poles, and now Greeks, arriving by the boatload from a homeland that had expelled them. For newcomers willing to work harder than the locals thought reasonable, doors could crack open. Aristotle arrived, knowing almost no Spanish, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and the money in his trousers. He washed dishes in a restaurant near the port. He delivered newspapers at dawn, then worked in grocery stores organizing inventory by day. He slept in dingy boarding houses where hot water was a luxury and breakfast was stale bread and bitter mate. He shared rooms with sailors and dock workers, men whose ambitions extended no further than the next paycheck. But Aristotle's ambitions were already pointing somewhere else entirely. His second job changed everything. He became a night telephone operator at a shipping and customs company. Sitting alone in a dim booth with headphones clamped to his ears, he listened to conversations he was never meant to hear. Businessmen negotiating freight contracts, bankers discussing credit lines, ship owners calculating tonnage and insurance, diplomats gossiping about tariffs and trade routes. Every call was a free seminar in how the world of money actually functioned. He memorized names, routes, prices, strategies. He took notes on scraps of paper hidden in his pockets. To most people, it was just noise on a line. To Aristotle Onassis, it was a roadmap to everything he intended to become. Part 2. Smoke and Steel. His first fortune came from smoke. Literally. Working at the customs company, Onassis had learned the mechanics of cross-border trade, inside and out tariffs, documentation, shipping routes, the margins where profit hid. He noticed that the Buenos Aires tobacco market was dominated by strong, dark blends. He saw a gap. Using contacts traced back to his father's old network in Turkey, he began importing blonde tobacco, lighter, smoother, a product that the market had not yet fully exploited. Some accounts say he marketed it specifically to women, packaging it with an air of European elegance. Others say he targeted the Greek diaspora, selling nostalgia in smoke form, a taste of the Aegean, for people far from home. Either way, the product moved. He launched the business with less than $200, roughly 2 years of savings from his various jobs. Within a year, he had quit his position at the shipping company. He brought on 2 partners and expanded into wine, coffee, seeds, and other commodities that could cross borders at a profit. He operated through the customs offices of Panama and Liberia, where regulations were looser and fees were lower than in Argentina. By the age of 25, he had earned his first $1 million, a sum that, adjusted for inflation, would be worth roughly $18 million today. It was an extraordinary achievement for a stateless immigrant with no university degree, no family connections in the New World, and no inherited capital. But tobacco was never the destination. It was the runway. Onassis spent hours at the Buenos Aires docks, watching merchant ships load and unload. He studied routes, calculated freight margins, asked questions that puzzled longshoremen and amused captains. He saw what was coming before most of the shipping world understood it. Oil was becoming the blood of modern civilization. Cars, aircraft, power plants, armies, factories, everything needed petroleum. But oil sitting underground or in storage tanks was worthless. It had to move. Pipelines were limited in reach. Rail was expensive. The future, the vast, lucrative, geopolitically decisive future, belonged to ocean tankers. And the man who controlled those tankers would control the choke point of global commerce. In the late 1920s, Onassis bought his first 2 ships. They were old, rusted freighters that established companies would have scrapped without a second thought. He purchased them for almost nothing, operated them with skeleton crews, and turned profits where others saw only risk and rust. Then came the Great Depression. While most ship owners hoarded their cash and waited for the storm to pass, Onassis did the opposite. He bought. Ships were selling at a fraction of their replacement cost, and he acquired them aggressively, one after another, bargains plucked from the wreckage of other men's caution. It was the first public display of what would become his signature strategy: buy when everyone else is running for the exits. By the mid-1930s, he was commissioning tankers on a scale that made the industry nervous. His vessels were larger than anything standard at the time. The logic was brutal and simple: the bigger the tanker, the lower the cost per barrel transported. He undercut competitors on price and won contracts from oil majors who cared about efficiency above all. He registered his fleet under flags of convenience in Panama and Liberia, dodging the heavy taxes and strict labor regulations that burdened traditional maritime nations like Britain and Greece. Old money ship owners sneered. They called it cheap, dishonorable, the tactic of an outsider who didn't understand the gentleman's code. Within a decade, most of them had quietly copied him. Today, the vast majority of the world's merchant fleet sails under flags of convenience, a system Onassis did not invent, but was among the first to weaponize. World War II both threatened and enriched him. Several of his ships were lost to the conflict, but the post-war era unleashed a tidal wave of demand. Europe needed rebuilding, and rebuilding required oil, steel, grain, all of it carried by sea. Onassis moved faster than his competitors, scooping up surplus American Liberty ships before others realized what they were worth, converting them for commercial use with minimal investment and maximum speed. By the 1950s, he controlled one of the largest private fleets in the world. His tankers carried the oil that powered cities, armies, and industries across continents. They were not just vessels, they were floating leverage. And then he pushed further. In the early 1950s, he negotiated directly with Saudi Arabia for exclusive oil transport rights, bypassing the Western oil cartel known as the Seven Sisters, the group of American and European companies that had monopolized global petroleum for decades. It was audacious, to the point of recklessness. He flew to the Middle East, sat with King Saud, and cut a deal that would have given him a stranglehold on Saudi crude shipments. The oil majors were furious. The American government intervened. The deal ultimately collapsed under enormous political and corporate pressure. But it demonstrated something the world had not yet fully grasped about Aristotle Onassis. He did not merely want contracts, he wanted monopolies. He was willing to walk into palaces and stare down kings, armed with nothing but charm, nerve, and the conviction that the rules of commerce were written by men and could be rewritten by better ones. There were darker chapters too. In the mid-1950s, Onassis entered the industrial whaling business in the Antarctic Ocean. His fleet, equipped with radar tracking and explosive harpoons, slaughtered thousands of blue whales, humpback whales, and right whales, species that were already sliding toward extinction. Norway and the United Kingdom accused him of violating international conservation treaties. When journalists questioned the ethics of it, he reportedly shrugged and offered a line that has followed his reputation ever since. Whales don't vote and they don't pay taxes. Argentina revoked his whaling permits in 1956. By then, he had already banked the profits and moved on. This was the pattern that defined his career. Onassis operated in the narrow space between vision and ruthlessness, between genius and exploitation. He saw opportunities others missed, but he also crossed lines others would not. His empire was built not just on steel, but on nerve, the unshakable conviction that rules existed to be bent by those bold enough to try, and for those who could not bend them, he simply went around. His chief rival understood this better than anyone. Stavros Niarchos, a fellow Greek shipping magnate, had married into the same Livanos dynasty. Tina's older sister Eugenia became Niarchos's wife. The two men circled each other for decades, like competing predators, sharing a single hunting ground. Niarchos was polished where Onassis was brash. Niarchos cultivated discretion where Onassis courted headlines. They competed for contracts, for prestige, for the title of largest tanker afloat. Each commissioned bigger and bigger vessels, sometimes undercutting rates, to the point where profit became secondary to the simple pleasure of humiliating the other. Their rivalry was personal, financial, and familial, a feud that blurred the line between business, war, and blood grudge. It sharpened both men, and it exhausted everyone around them. Part 3. Stages. A lesser man would have been content with the fortune. Onassis wanted the world to watch him spend it. He understood something that most wealthy men of his era did not grasp, or at least did not act upon. In the 20th century, image was as powerful as capital. To be rich was not enough. To be seen as rich, dazzling, magnetic, untouchable was the true currency, and Onassis spent it lavishly. Monaco became his first great stage. The tiny principality on the French Riviera was already a playground for royals, Hollywood stars, and financiers. Onassis bought a controlling stake in the Monte Carlo casino and its surrounding real estate, struck friendships with Prince Rainier, and positioned himself squarely at the center of Mediterranean high society. The audacity was staggering. Here was a refugee from a burned city, a man who had washed dishes in Buenos Aires barely 2 decades earlier, now sitting at tables with princes, discussing business and pleasure as though he had been born into silk. Old European money watched him with a mixture of fascination and barely concealed contempt. He wore their tuxedos, but refused to play by their rules. He was too loud, too brash, too willing to spend in ways that announced rather than whispered. If old money was a portrait painted in muted oils, Onassis was a neon sign blazing against the night sky, and the world could not look away. In 1954, he purchased a decommissioned Canadian Navy frigate, the HMCS Stormont, for $4,000 at a naval surplus auction. He then poured over $4 million into a transformation that defied imagination. When the work was finished, the battered warship had become the Christina O, the most extravagant private yacht the world had ever seen, over 300 feet long. A swimming pool lined with mosaics depicting scenes from the Trojan War, its floor engineered to rise at the touch of a button and become a dance floor. A wood-paneled library stocked for a prime minister's taste. Staterooms that rivaled 5-star hotels, with Italian marble, gold-plated fixtures, and chandeliers that had no business being at sea. One persistent account, never fully confirmed, never fully denied, claims the bar stools were upholstered in whale foreskin. True or not, the story itself became part of the legend, which was perhaps the point. The yacht was not transportation, it was theater, and the guest list was the cast. Winston Churchill spent entire weeks aboard, smoking cigars and drinking whiskey in the library, while the Mediterranean glittered outside the portholes. Maria Callas sang under the stars on its afterdeck. Greta Garbo vanished into its staterooms for days at a time. Frank Sinatra drank until dawn. Heads of state, Hollywood royalty, European aristocrats all came aboard. And in 1957, a young senator's wife named Jacqueline Kennedy stepped onto the deck for the first time. Onassis, captivated by her elegant distance, had already begun calculating his next great acquisition, though no one else noticed yet. Every invitation to the Christina O was an investment in mythology. Every guest who accepted lent a piece of their reputation to Onassis and borrowed a piece of his aura in return. To drink his champagne, to sleep in his staterooms, to watch the sunset from his deck, these were not social pleasantries. They were transactions in the economy of prestige. On land, the theater continued with even greater ambition. In 1963, Onassis purchased the island of Skorpios, a rocky outcrop off the western coast of Greece, near Lefkada. The price was almost absurdly low, roughly equivalent to $1,000 at the time. What he found was scrubland, bare rock, sparse vegetation, no roads, no water system, no electricity, nothing that would make a reasonable person see value. What he built was a manufactured paradise. He shipped in sand from other islands to create beaches where none existed. He transplanted thousands of olive and pine trees from the mainland, along with soil to sustain them. Engineers laid roads, plumbing, power lines. Marble villas rose from the hillsides with terraces overlooking the Ionian Sea. Exotic gardens bloomed with flowers imported from distant countries. Scorpios was not discovered. It was invented. Onassis had rewritten geography itself, imposing his will on the landscape the way he imposed it on markets and governments. Workers labored for months, carving roads into hillsides, drilling wells, laying cables across the seabed to connect the island to the mainland electrical grid. Landscapers arrived with drawings that looked more like architectural blueprints than garden plans. When the work was finished, guests stepping off the boat onto Scorpios would have had no idea that 3 years earlier there had been nothing here but goats and dry grass. In Greek mythology, islands were the domains of gods, heroes, and exiles. Onassis had built his own Olympus, and he ruled it absolutely. In London, the family maintained a townhouse on Grosvenor Square in Mayfair, one of the most prestigious addresses in the British Empire. The house was a declaration. The refugee from Smyrna now held a seat at the table of European aristocracy. Jackie Kennedy would later receive guests under chandeliers that had once glittered for dukes and ambassadors. The drawing rooms hosted dinners where business deals floated over cocktails, and the guest list itself functioned as a social currency. For Aristotle, every invitation sent from Grosvenor Square carried a message that went beyond hospitality. I am not an outsider anymore. I am hosting the insiders. And in New York, Jackie maintained her apartment on Fifth Avenue, overlooking Central Park, a refuge so different from the Mediterranean spectacles that it felt like a separate world entirely. After the assassination of President Kennedy, she had needed somewhere to retreat, a place where her children could grow without the constant flash of cameras. The apartment was elegant but understated, filled with books, photographs, carefully chosen art. Where Aristotle's spaces were designed to dazzle, Jackie's were designed to breathe. Fifth Avenue was her territory, a space where she set the tone, and where privacy was treated as sacred. Each property in the Onassis empire told a different story. The yacht said, "I am powerful." The island said, "I am sovereign." The London house said, "I belong here." The New York apartment said, "Leave me alone." Together, they formed the architecture of a dynasty that was as much about image as it was about wealth, and that was beginning to crack under the weight of its own contradictions. Part 4. The marriage that shook the world. Before Jackie, there was Maria. Aristotle Onassis met Maria Callas in 1957 at a dinner in Venice. He was 51. She was 33, the most celebrated soprano alive, a woman whose voice could fill an opera house and whose temperament could empty one just as quickly. They shared a hunger that went beyond fame or fortune. Both were self-invented. Both were relentless in their pursuit of greatness. Both understood that performance was not separate from life. It was life's essential strategy. In 1959, Callas boarded the Christina O for a cruise through the Greek islands. The nights were long. The wine was endless. The attraction between them became undeniable, then unconcealable. By the end of that voyage, their affair was an open secret across European high society. When Onassis's wife Tina discovered them together in a cabin aboard the yacht in 1960, she filed for divorce, took the children, and severed his access to her father's powerful shipping empire. For Callas, the relationship was total and consuming. Around 1960, she reportedly gave birth to a son in Milan who died within hours, a tragedy that was kept hidden from the public for years. She fell into a deep depression. Onassis, characteristically, carried on as if nothing of particular importance had happened. Feelings for him were always secondary to the next move. Then, in 1968, he made the move that stunned the world. On October 20th, Aristotle Onassis married Jacqueline Kennedy in a private civil ceremony on Scorpios. He was 62, she was 39. The images, Jackie in a cream-colored Valentino gown against the backdrop of the island's imported beaches, Aristotle beside her with his ever-present cigar, circled the globe within hours and detonated like a cultural bomb. America reacted with shock that shaded quickly into outrage. Jacqueline Kennedy was supposed to remain the eternal widow of Camelot, frozen in grief, draped forever in black mourning, devoted to the memory of her martyred husband. To see her pledging herself to a man 23 years older, a Greek shipping tycoon whose reputation was equal parts glamour and scandal, felt to millions of Americans like a betrayal of something almost sacred. Newspapers called it a sellout. Columnists accused her of trading JFK's memory for a foreign billionaire's checkbook. Even members of the Kennedy family reportedly reacted with disbelief. But the calculation on both sides was far more complex than the headlines could contain. Since the assassination in Dallas, Jackie had lived under a constant shadow of threat and grief. The murder of Bobby Kennedy in June 1968, just 5 years after her husband's death, deepened her terror that she and her children were marked for violence. Onassis offered something that almost no one else on Earth could provide: total security. He had private islands surrounded by water, private yachts staffed with crew, private jets that could be wheels up within the hour. He could seal off entire worlds from the chaos of American politics and the menace of random violence. For a woman who had watched her husband's skull shatter beside her in a convertible, that kind of protection was not luxury. It was survival. For Onassis, the marriage was the ultimate trophy of social conquest. Jackie brought him what no amount of money could purchase on the open market: the legitimacy of American political royalty, the shimmering aura of Camelot, a wife so globally famous that even the most skeptical European aristocrats would fall silent. She was the acquisition that completed his collection. Maria Callas learned of the wedding from the newspapers. No one called her. No one thought to prepare her. Years later, she reportedly confided to a close friend, "That day I died, though the world believed I was still alive." The marriage itself was troubled almost from its first weeks. Jackie found Onassis controlling, loud, and culturally alien. He found her cold, extravagant, and maddeningly independent, spending enormous sums on clothes, art, and security, while maintaining a separate life in New York that felt more like strategic withdrawal than partnership. They clashed over money, over manners, over the fundamental rhythms of daily existence. Friends recalled dinners on Scorpios, where the silence between them stretched into minutes, and evenings where Jackie would vanish into a stack of books, leaving her husband to fume alone with his cigar. Onassis reportedly attempted multiple times to annul the marriage or renegotiate its terms. The prenuptial contract which he himself had structured was ironclad. He had built a cage he could not escape. And through it all, he kept returning to Callas. She never fully forgave him. She also never learned to refuse him. The triangle, the widow, the magnate, and the diva played out across years of whispered phone calls, furtive meetings, and gossip columns that fed on every rumor. Part 5. The Unraveling. On January 23, 1973, the phone rang with news that would break Aristotle Onassis in a way that no rival, no government, no market crash ever had. His son, Alexander, 24 years old, had crashed a Piaggio P-136 aircraft at Elinikon Airport in Athens. The plane belonged to Olympic Aviation, the regional airline subsidiary that Onassis himself had founded as part of his transportation empire. Alexander had been piloting the aircraft or co-piloting, depending on the account. He survived the impact but suffered catastrophic cranial trauma. He died in the hospital hours later. For the man who had survived the burning of Smyrna, the poverty of Buenos Aires, corporate wars on 3 continents, and the relentless scrutiny of the world's press, this was the blow from which there was no recovery. There was no strategy for it, no countermove, no deal to be struck. Witnesses described Aristotle as physically transformed overnight. The booming confidence disappeared, his shoulders stooped, he stopped eating for days. He grew obsessed with the idea that Alexander's death was not an accident, but deliberate sabotage, perhaps orchestrated by business rivals, perhaps by enemies within his own corporate structure. He hired private investigators, filed lawsuits against the aircraft manufacturer Piaggio, pressured the Greek government for answers. He spent years and millions searching for proof of conspiracy. He never found it. All he found was silence and a small grave on Scorpios. Alexander's death was more than personal devastation. It was a dynastic catastrophe. Alexander had been groomed as the heir, the son, who would take the helm of the shipping empire and carry it into the future. Without him, the entire architecture of succession that Onassis had spent decades building collapsed in a single afternoon. The fortress he had constructed against his own childhood displacement now had no one to garrison it. The burden fell to Christina. Christina Onassis was bright, sharp-tongued, and fiercely intelligent qualities that sometimes clashed with her father's need for absolute control. But she was also profoundly lonely. Growing up in the shadow of one of the world's most dominant personalities, shuttled between yachts and penthouses and private islands, she had never been allowed to develop a life that belonged to her alone. After Alexander's death, Aristotle looked to her as the keeper of the empire. Yet Christina had never shared his appetite for commercial warfare. She managed the fortune with competence, but it was duty rather than passion. She once remarked, with the kind of dark wit that characterized her private persona, that she would happily trade her entire inheritance for a single day of genuine happiness. Her personal life became a subject of relentless tabloid fascination. She married 4 times Joseph Bolker, an American businessman, in a union quickly annulled, Sergei Kauzov, a Soviet shipping executive, Thierry Roussel, a French businessman who would father her only child, and one other brief marriage. Each ended in divorce. Each failure deepened her isolation. Newspapers branded her the unhappy heiress and documented her weight fluctuations, her health struggles, her bouts of depression with the same avidity they once reserved for her father's business deals. What for anyone else would have been private pain became public entertainment. She resented Jackie's presence in her father's world. She viewed the marriage as an intrusion, a spotlight amplifier on a family already crushed under the weight of public attention. Meanwhile, Aristotle was dying. Doctors diagnosed myasthenia gravis, a degenerative neuromuscular disease that slowly dismantled his body. First, his legs weakened, then his hands. Eventually, he could not hold a fork without trembling, could not rise from a chair without assistance. The man who had once strode into royal palaces to negotiate with kings now needed help getting dressed in the morning. He had deposits in 217 banks around the world. He controlled over 70 vessels. He owned properties across New York, Paris, Monte Carlo, Acapulco, and Athens. He had an airline, an island, a yacht that carried more history in its wake than most museums hold in their halls. He had everything a human being could accumulate. He did not have peace. Jackie was not with him at the end. She was traveling in the United States. Christina was present, though she was herself barely holding together a young woman already fractured by loss, now watching her father dissolve. On March 15, 1975, Aristotle Onassis died at the American hospital of Neuilly-sur-Seine, outside Paris. He was 69 years old. The immediate cause was a pulmonary infection. He died in the company of his daughter, a nurse, and the doctor who signed the death certificate. There were no crowds, no cameras, no champagne. He was buried on Scorpios, next to Alexander, beneath a simple stone on the island he had built from nothing. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis received $20.5 million from the estate settlement. Christina received everything else. And everything else was a curse wearing the mask of a fortune. Part 6. The Last Onassis. Christina lasted 13 more years. She moved across continents: Paris, Buenos Aires, New York, Athens, Switzerland, searching for a home that never materialized into anything more than another expensive address. She managed the Onassis holdings in shipping, real estate, and aviation. She oversaw the family's philanthropic foundations, ensuring that her father's name lived on in cultural and medical institutions. She made decisions that would have earned Aristotle's grudging respect, if not his praise. But her personal life remained a cycle of failed intimacy, tabloid humiliation, and deepening exhaustion. In 1985, she gave birth to her daughter Athena, from her marriage to Thierry Roussel. It was, by all accounts, the single, unambiguous joy of her adult life. She poured herself into motherhood with a ferocity that friends described as both beautiful and desperate, as though she were trying to give her child the stability and unconditional love that she herself had never known. In November 1988, Cristina Onassis was found dead in the bathtub of a friend's house in Buenos Aires. She was 37 years old. The official cause was pulmonary edema, but the speculation that followed exhaustion, medication, depression, the accumulated toll of a life spent under unbearable pressure and relentless public scrutiny painted a picture far more complicated than any single medical diagnosis could capture. Whatever killed her, it was not a lack of resources. It was something that resources could not touch. Her daughter Athena was 3 years old. The Onassis dynasty, once a family that commanded fleets across oceans, hosted heads of state on a private island, and married into the most famous political family in American history, had narrowed to a single child who could not yet read her own name. Athena Onassis Roussel grew up in Switzerland, far from the Mediterranean stages where her grandfather had performed his legend. Raised by her father and overseen by a Swiss trust that managed her inheritance, she lived a life defined more by discretion than display. She attended quiet schools. She rode horses. She stayed out of the newspapers. Horses, in fact, became her anchor the same way they had once been for her grandmother Jackie, who found on the trails of New Jersey's horse country the control and freedom that the rest of her life denied her. Athena became a serious competitive show jumper, training with discipline and traveling the international circuit. In the saddle, no one cared about her surname. What mattered was skill, nerve, and the willingness to fall and get back up. Horses, unlike people, did not calculate the value of her inheritance before deciding how to treat her. She married in 2005 Álvaro de Miranda Neto, a Brazilian Olympic show jumper. The wedding in São Paulo drew enormous press attention, but the marriage eventually followed the pattern that had haunted her mother: disputes, separation, divorce in 2016. The echoes were impossible to ignore. In 2013, Athena sold Scorpios, the island her grandfather had invented from barren rock and imported sand. The island where Jackie Kennedy had married Aristotle under the world's gaze to a Russian billionaire named Dmitry Rybolovlev. She offered no dramatic explanation. She simply let it go. For those who saw the Onassis legacy as something sacred, the sale felt like a final curtain falling. For Athena, it may have felt like the lifting of a weight she had never asked to carry. Today, Athena lives largely out of the spotlight. She competes quietly in equestrian events. She manages her affairs with a discretion that would have been unrecognizable to her grandfather. She almost never speaks to the press. If Aristotle Onassis embodied ambition and Cristina Onassis embodied fragility, Athena embodies something different: withdrawal. The deliberate, considered choice to exist beyond the reach of a myth she did not create. The story of the last Onassis remains unfinished. But the question it raises was there from the very beginning, from the moment a 16-year-old boy watched his city burn and swore that he would never be powerless again. Closing. Aristotle Onassis built his empire to ensure that no fire, no war, no act of fate could ever strip him bare again. And in the narrowest sense, he succeeded. He accumulated wealth that rivaled nations. He turned a rusted warship into a floating palace. He turned a barren island into paradise. He married the most famous woman in America. He bent the rules of global commerce until they fit the shape of his ambition. And yet, his son died in a plane crash at 24. His daughter died alone in a bathtub at 37. His granddaughter sold his island to a stranger. The yachts still sail. The marble villas still stand on Scorpios, under new ownership. But the dynasty he built to outlast history, the fortress against memory, the empire that was supposed to endure, lasted exactly 2 generations before it dissolved into silence. There is a saying in old immigrant communities: we left with nothing, so we had to dream bigger than everyone else. Aristotle Onassis, dreamed bigger than almost anyone who ever lived. He dreamed in steel and marble, in tanker hulls and imported sand, in guest lists and headlines, and the endless performance of power. He dreamed so loudly that the world mistook the noise for meaning, and so relentlessly that his own children could not hear themselves think above the roar of his ambition. Christina once said she wished her silver spoon had been made of plastic. Alexander wanted to fly planes, not run shipping lines. Athena wanted to ride horses in peace. None of them asked for the empire. All of them paid for it. The question his story leaves behind is whether the dream was worth the price, not just for him, but for everyone who carried his name after he was gone. Whether a fortress built against one man's fear can ever be a home for the people who live inside it. Whether the hunger that drives a refugee to conquer the world is the same hunger that, left unchecked, consumes the world he built. The sea does not remember the ships that crossed it, but it keeps the ones that sank.